Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a stack of medical sources and performing a pretty comprehensive deep dive into sexually transmitted infections.
Right.
And this isn't just about, listing symptoms. This is really about understanding the fundamental biology, how these pathogens actually operate, how they manage to evade the immune system, and, crucially, why so many of them spread almost silently.
Exactly. Our mission today really is to give you, the listener, a kind of systematic framework for understanding these conditions. We want to connect the pathogen-specific survival strategy, what we call the pathophysiology, directly to the unique symptoms you might actually see in a patient.
Okay.
We're essentially decoding the mechanism behind that altered health state.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because it seems like the central conflict, the main issue in this whole field is the silent spread. The sources really emphasize that the majority of STIs are frequently asymptomatic, particularly in the early stages or maybe in specific groups, and that factor is precisely what ensures they just keep persisting.
That narrative thread is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
If we try to simplify the landscape a bit, we basically have two main management categories. First, 4 bacterial infections that right now are currently curable.
Okay.
It's trichomoniasis, syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia.
Got it.
And then there are 4 viral infections that are generally considered incurable, where the focus shifts more to management.
Right.
Those are hepatitis B, herpes simplex virus, or HSV, HIV, and human papillomavirus, HPV. So we'll sort of tour these by location, external, then internal vaginal infections, and finally the systemic ones.
Okay, starting externally then. The sources say the most common STI in the U.S., maybe even globally, is genital warts, or Condylomata acuminata, and that's caused by human papillomavirus, HPV.
That's right. HPV is a DNA virus.
Yeah.
You can almost think of it like a cellular construction foreman that's sort of gone rogue.
Bruh.
Its mechanism is pretty simple, but very effective. When it infects those external epithelial cells, it basically just stimulates them to replicate like crazy.
Oh.
And that over-replication is what creates those characteristic raised fleshy lesions we commonly call warts.
Okay, but here's where the context gets really important, doesn't it? We always hear about HPV and cancer, specifically those high-risk types 16 and 18, causing cervical and anogenital cancers. But what's the bigger picture? Is everyone with HPV at risk?
That's a great question. And the bigger picture is actually, for the most part, a massive immunological success story.
Really?
Yeah. Over 90%, think about that, over 90% of HPV infections clear up spontaneously, usually within about 2 years, simply because of an intact immune system doing its job.
Wow.
So for most people, the virus is highly transient. Progression to cancer usually requires other factors, like maybe co-infections or some kind of immune weakness,
I see.
meaning your own immune response is really the true determinant of whether this virus ends up being benign or potentially deadly. And thankfully, we now have highly effective prevention through the available vaccines, which specifically target those high-risk strains like 16 and 18.
Okay, so that's HPV. Moving to another external infection, genital herpes. Now, this is where that idea of the hidden enemy becomes quite literal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because herpes, HSV, is what we call a neurotropic virus. That means it has an affinity for nerves. It loves nerves.
Okay.
It causes the initial, often very painful lesions right there at the infection site. But instead of being cleared by the immune system, it uses the peripheral nerves almost like a private highway. It ascends up these nerves and takes up residence, goes dormant, inside this tiny sort of bunker near your spinal cord. It's called the sacral dorsal root ganglia.
A neural bunker. So, if it's hiding out in there, what does that mean for the patient? And for treatment, why is it considered incurable?
It means, quite simply, that the immune system can't get to it. It cannot touch the dormant virus while it's hiding.
Right.
So during that initial primary infection, the lesions are typically excruciatingly painful, often wet ulcers, and they frequently come with systemic symptoms too, like fever and muscle aches. Yeah. And the virus is actively shedding for maybe 10 to 15 days then. But the recurring episodes, the outbreaks, they're caused by the virus reactivating, traveling back down that same nerve route, and causing generally milder, shorter outbreaks.
I see.
So antivirals, like valacyclovir, they don't cure it. They simply decrease the frequency and severity of those outbreaks, because you can only really treat the virus when it comes out of its hiding spot.
Okay, so if the external infections are kind of like a game of viral hide and seek, what happens when we move inward, when the vaginal ecosystem itself gets disrupted? Let's transition to those vaginal infections.
Right. The internal environment of the vagina is normally governed by this really delicate balance of protective bacteria, mainly lactobacilli.
Okay.
When that balance shifts, that's when you start seeing problems. We can start with candidiasis, or what most people call a yeast infection. This one often isn't sexually transmitted, but it requires a favorable environment to grow out of control.
And what kind of things set the stage for that yeast overgrowth?
Well, anything that suppresses those protective lactobacilli, like taking a course of antibiotics recently, that's a classic one.
Right.
Or, alternatively, anything that increases the available food source for the yeast. Things like high hormone levels, maybe from pregnancy, or taking oral contraceptives, which increase the glycogen stores in the vaginal lining.
Okay. And clinically, this gives us that really signature finding, doesn't it? The discharge is usually described as thick, white, and odorless, often kind of like cottage cheese or curd-like.
Exactly. Curd-like is the description you often hear.
And the vaginal environment stays highly acidic, typically below a pH of 4.5, which is actually a useful clue to distinguish it from some other infections.
That's a key diagnostic point, yeah. Contrast that very sharply with trichomoniasis. This is caused by a motile anaerobic protozoan called T. vaginalis.
Okay.
Now, this one is a confirmed STI, and it's actually startlingly common, much more prevalent than gonorrhea, for instance.
Really? More than gonorrhea?
Yeah, far more. And often, men are asymptomatic carriers, so they can unwittingly pass it along without even knowing they have it.
Wow. So for women who do get symptoms, what does it look like? The sources describe it pretty vividly.
They do. The parasite essentially feeds on the vaginal mucosa, causing inflammation. This leads to a copious, often frothy, usually malodorous green or yellow discharge.
Frothy green. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, quite distinct. And sometimes the inflammation on the cervix is so severe that you can actually see these tiny little hemorrhagic spots, which has earned them the nickname strawberry spots.
Strawberry spots. Got it.
Diagnosis usually involves identifying that rapidly moving that motile protozoan on a wet mount slide. And because it's a true infection caused by a parasite, treatment requires systemic therapy, usually metronidazole or kinidazole for both the patient and their partner. You have to treat both to cure it and prevent that ping-pong effect of reinfection.
Right, makes sense. Okay, finally in this group, bacterial vaginosis, or BV. The sources say this is the most common cause of vaginal discharge overall, and it's a really great example of pathophysiology in action.
Absolutely. BV is a perfect illustration. Think of it less like an infection by a specific pathogen and more like a hostile takeover of the ecosystem.
Okay.
The protective lactobacilli, sort of the police force, they get displaced and overwhelmed by an overgrowth of various anaerobic bacteria like Gardnerella vaginalis. This massive shift in the microbial balance leads to the production of large amounts of chemical compounds called amines.
Amines. And those amines are the key, then, to the main clinical sign.
Exactly. They're the direct cause of the hallmark symptom. A thin, grayish-white discharge that has a characteristic foul, fishy odor. That distinct smell is those volatile amines being released into the air.
Fascinating.
And diagnostically, we look for what are called clue cells on the wet mount. Those are vaginal epithelial cells just covered in bacteria. And we also note that the vaginal pH has shifted, becoming less acidic, typically jumping above 4.5.
All right, so we've covered external, we've covered internal vaginal issues. Let's turn now to the infections that don't just affect the local tissues, but actually have the potential to go, well, global in the body and cause really serious systemic devastation. We're talking chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis.
Right, the big three bacterial STIs with systemic potential. We'll start with chlamydia, caused by C. trachomatis. It's the most prevalent bacterial STI in the U.S., and it's another master of stealth.
Yeah, its life cycle sounds quite complicated. Why is it so unique? And what does that unique survival strategy actually mean for the body? How does it hide so well?
It's fascinating, really. Chlamydia is what we call an obligate intracellular pathogen. That means it absolutely cannot reproduce outside of a host cell.
Okay.
It exists in two distinct forms. There's the infectious elementary body, which is like a tough little seed that gets inside the host cell. Then, once inside, it transforms into the reticulate body, which is the metabolically active form that multiplies rapidly within the cell.
Hiding inside the cells.
Precisely. Its entire strategy revolves around hiding inside your own cells, which is why it's so often completely asymptomatic, especially in women.
And the implication of that hiding is potentially severe, isn't it? Women might have a subtle mucopurulent discharge, maybe, but the infection can silently creep upwards, leading to pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, and ultimately scarring and sterility.
That's the major danger in women, yes. And for men, while urethritis is common, The systemic link is also quite striking with something called Reiter syndrome.
Ah, yes, the triad.
That's the one, that classic triad of urethritis, inflammation of the urethra, conjunctivitis, eye inflammation, and arthritis, particularly in the weight-bearing joints.
So how do you even test for such a stealthy pathogen?
Well, because it hides so well, testing relies heavily on high-tech methods now, specifically nucleic acid amplification tests, or NATEs. Yeah. These can detect the organism's DNA or RNA with extremely high sensitivity, even from urine samples. And often, these tests check for gonorrhea at the same time. Thankfully, treatment is still highly effective with antibiotics like azithromycin or doxycycline.
Okay. So next up is gonorrhea, caused by N-gonorrhea. This one sounds more like a classic bacterial infection, pyogenic, meaning pus forming, causing intense local inflammation.
That's right. Gonorrhea typically causes a much more intense, acute inflammatory reaction compared to chlamydia. It's known for being pyogenic.
Okay.
In men, the symptoms are often quite dramatic. Significant urethral pain, and usually a creamy yellow, sometimes even bloody discharge.
Pretty obvious then.
Often, yes. In women, however, symptoms can still be nonspecific or mild, sometimes just increased discharge or painful intercourse or urination. But like chlamydia, if it spreads upwards, it can cause PID, scarring, and sterility. And if it really gets loose in the bloodstream, it can cause disseminated gonococcal infection or DGI.
DGI, what does that involve?
That's when the bacteria spreads throughout the body, potentially affecting the joints, causing septic arthritis, the heart valves causing endocarditis, or even the meninges causing meningitis. It's serious.
This definitely raises the biggest public health concern we hear about with gonorrhea: antibiotic resistance. The sources paint a really scary picture here, don't they?
They absolutely do. Gonorrhea has proven incredibly adept at developing resistance to pretty much every antibiotic we've thrown at it over the decades. It's considered one of the most urgent antimicrobial resistance threats globally.
Urgent threat.
Yes. The declining effectiveness, even resistance, to the traditionally used oral cephalosporin antibiotics has forced bodies like the CDC to now recommend dual therapy.
Dual therapy, what's that?
It means using 2 different antibiotics simultaneously.
Yep.
The current standard recommendation is an injection of ceftriaxone combined with a second oral antibiotic, usually azithromycin.
Wow, an injection plus an oral pill.
Exactly. It's a clear indicator that we're really running out of easy single-drug oral options for treating gonorrhea effectively.
That is concerning. Okay, finally, in the systemic group, we have syphilis, caused by the Spearshett Treponema pallidum. This one is almost legendary, isn't it? Characterized by its deceiving, decades-long, 3-stage progression.
It truly is a historical masterpiece of devastation, partly because of how it progresses. It starts with primary syphilis, and the hallmark here is the chancre.
The chancre.
Yes, and it's absolutely crucial to understand this lesion. It's typically single, it's indurated, meaning firm or hard, and it is completely painless.
Painless? That seems counterintuitive for a serious infection.
It really does,
Yes.
and that's exactly why it's so dangerous, because it's painless, and because it often heals spontaneously within a few weeks even without treatment, it frequently gets missed or ignored. But meanwhile, the Spearshett bacteria are quietly beginning their systemic infiltration throughout the body.
It's just hard to imagine something so potentially destructive, starting with a single painless ulcer. So if the primary stage is missed because it's painless, what happens when it goes systemic in the secondary syphilis stage?
That's when the body finally mounts a more visible, systemic reaction to the widespread bacterial spread. Patients typically develop symptoms like fever, malaise, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and a characteristic widespread rash.
The rash is key, right?
Very key. It characteristically appears on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, which is quite unusual for rashes.
Palms and soles. Okay.
Secondary syphilis also features highly infectious, moist, raised lesions, particularly in warm, moist areas like the groin or underarms. Now, these are called condylomata lata. They look a bit like warts, but are different from HPV warts and teeming with spearshets.
Highly infectious. Okay. And if that still goes untreated, it can enter a latent phase, right? Sometimes for decades before potentially progressing to the final stage.
Exactly. After the secondary symptoms resolve, the disease enters a latent period. It can be early latent within the first year or latent after a year. During latency, there are no outward signs, but the bacteria are still present. Then years or even decades later, in maybe 15–30% of untreated individuals, it can progress to tertiary syphilis.
And this is the truly destructive final act.
This is the destructive final act, yes. It manifests in 3 main devastating forms. First, you can get localized, rubbery, necrotic lesions called gummas. These can occur in various organs, often the liver, bones, or skin.
Yumma.
Second, you can have devastating cardiovascular syphilis, classically causing aneurysms of the ascending aorta, which can be fatal.
Wow.
And third, you can get neurosyphilis, where the spirochetes damage the central nervous system, leading to a whole range of neurological problems, including dementia, blindness, paralysis, just catastrophic damage.
It's incredible how it progresses. How is it diagnosed and treated now?
Diagnosis relies mainly on serology blood tests.
Hmm.
Screening tests like VDRL or RPR detect antibodies, but they can have false positives. So positive screens are confirmed with more specific tests like FTA-ABS, which detect antibodies specifically against Treponema pallidum.
Okay.
And the good news, despite its severity, is that penicillin, the original antibiotic, still remains the treatment of choice for all stages of syphilis.
Still penicillin after all this time. Still penicillin. However, because the spirochete divides slowly, treatment requires maintaining effective drug levels in the tissues over a prolonged period. This usually means using long-acting injectable forms of penicillin, like benzathine penicillin G.
Right, the long-acting shots.
Yeah.
Okay, before we wrap up, we really should touch on one more infection that sort of changes the rules of transmission a bit. The Zika virus.
Ah, yes, Zika. It's fascinating and concerning because it has multiple transmission routes. It's primarily known as being transmitted by the Aedes mosquito bite, like dengue or chikungunya,
Right.
but crucially, it can also be transmitted sexually through oral, vaginal, or anal sex.
Yeah.
And perhaps most critically, it can be transmitted vertically from a pregnant woman to her fetus during pregnancy.
And that vertical transmission is the major concern, isn't it? While symptoms in the adult are usually pretty mild, maybe a fever, rash, joint pain. Exactly. Most adults have mild illness or are even asymptomatic. But the risk to the unborn fetus is immediate and potentially severe. Zika infection during pregnancy is strongly linked to devastating birth defects, most notably microcephaly, where the baby's head and brain are abnormally small.
Microcephaly.
Yes, and other serious brain defects, eye problems, hearing loss, and impaired growth.
That just elevates the urgency for screening pregnant women, especially those with potential exposure, doesn't it? Since there's currently no vaccine or specific curative treatment available.
Precisely. Prevention is absolutely everything with Zika. That means focusing entirely on reducing mosquito exposure, using repellent, eliminating breeding sites, and preventing sexual transmission through consistent condom use, especially if a partner has traveled to an area with Zika. It's a stark reminder that new pathogens can emerge quickly and utilize multiple, sometimes unexpected transmission routes.
Wow. Okay, that was a truly comprehensive look at these key altered health states related to STIs. We really connected the dots, didn't we? From the neurotropism of HSV leading to its latency, to the ecosystem imbalance of BV causing that characteristic fishy odor,
Right, the alleles.
and the sheer stealth and immune evasion of the spirochete T. pallidum, allowing for its devastating three-stage progression.
Yeah.
The complexity of these infections, and especially, as we said at the start, the prevalence of asymptomatic carriers, whether it's HPV, herpes, chlamydia, gonorrhea, even trich in men, it really underscores why these diseases continue to pose such a significant public health challenge.
Absolutely. And maybe to connect this back to the bigger picture, and particularly our discussion about drug-resistant gonorrhea. Think about this. What biological factors, or even sociological factors like inconsistent treatment or access to care, could accelerate the trend of antibiotic resistance in those currently curable bacterial STIs, to the point where they become universally incurable, much like the viral STIs we discussed, forcing medicine to rely solely on managing symptoms rather than achieving a cure.
That's a sobering thought. Turning curable diseases into merely manageable ones because we're running out of effective drugs.
That's the challenge medicine is increasingly facing right now. It really highlights the importance of prevention, responsible antibiotic use, and continued research into new treatments and vaccines. It's a race against microbial evolution.